Aileen Wuornos, a convicted serial killer of 7 men, presents a complicated psychological profile marked by extensive developmental trauma and diagnoses of borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder as well as psychopathy. In her final interview the day before her execution, she displayed signs of psychosis and paranoia, as well as a complete lack of willingness to accept responsibility for her actions and overwhelming anger towards society. It's a very different interview than Ted Bundy's final interview, and if you haven't seen that one, I'd recommend watching it after this to really appreciate the contrast. With that said, let's begin the interview and analysis.
I was just wondering how you're going to be, at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Are you prepared?
I'm prepared. I'm all right. I'm all right with it.
Initially, it appears that Wuornos displays a level of acceptance and resignation about her impending execution. Let's see if that mask remains throughout the rest of the interview. In my experience, masks are easy to maintain for short periods, but falter over longer periods of time and when the mask wearer gets angry. Pro tip: sometimes engendering emotion in a patient or interviewee can be a great way to test whether they're malingering or not. On one memorable occasion, a man who was unable to walk due to medical negligence got so annoyed during an interview that he stood up out of the wheelchair, stormed towards me and shouted at me as he loomed over me. It was really gratifying to have cured his paralysis in just one session, after him being unable to mobilize properly for several years. Needless to say, once my report reached his lawyer, his legal action was halted.
And how
I'm all right with it, but like I said, remember, let them know that I know that the cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up and let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer. I know they did, because I was no professional serial killer or anything, murderer, whatever you want to call it, Wasn't special at what I was doing.
Eileen,
I did some sloppy work, and I left.
This statement reflects a strong sense of paranoia and a belief in a conspiracy against her. This could be consistent with delusional thinking and psychosis, or it could be driven by her borderline and psychopath desire to place the blame for her murders on others. Unfortunately, the interviewer doesn't follow up to differentiate between these motivations. Essentially, her argument is that it isn't entirely her fault she killed so many because this was allowed or manipulated to be by the police. Either way, though, we can say that her claim that the police deliberately allowed her to continue killing to
turn me into a serial killer
is indicative of her lack of taking responsibility for her actions, a characteristic of antisocial and borderline personality disorders.
How have you prepared yourself for tomorrow morning?
I'm all right with it. Yeah, I'm ready to go. Hey, I was tortured at BCI. They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997.
Sonic
And every
pressure.
time I was trying to write something, I think they had some kind of eye in the cell, I'm not sure, but every time I started writing something, it went up higher. So I'm thinking that probably had the TV rigged. The TV or the mirror, something was rigged. They got a huge satellite on the compound. After they put the huge satellite on the compound, it could have been either rigged to the TV set or the mirror or something, because the electrician, when he put the mirror on the wall, he said, doesn't that look like a computer? The back of it, and he stuck it to the wall.
Wuornos describes what she believes to be methods of psychological and physical torture, which aligns with her symptoms of psychosis, particularly paranoid delusions. Interestingly, this sonic pressure issue is one I've come across before with patients. Sonic pressure and electromagnetic interference are popular explanations for what persecutes them among those who are psychotic. It appears clear that Wuornos was psychotic during this interview, the day before she was executed. The next questions which matter are: firstly, was she psychotic when she killed? And secondly, should her execution have been delayed due to her psychosis? Let's continue and find the answers.
And do you think did that affect your mind, do you think?
Huh?
Did that affect your mind in some way, the sonic?
It was crushing my head, and they were using sonic pressure continually. Then when I had 3 meetings with Miss Villacorta on it, Every meeting I had, she increased the pressure of the volume of the comm, increased the harassment on the floor, increased the trays being inedible, just increased every bit of my complaints and trashed all grievances. They're trying to make it look like I was crazy at all times, rig up the room with torture. If I said anything about I think their whole plan was to try to make it look like I was totally crazy. And so nobody would believe anything I had to say about anything. And then drive me there if they could. I suffered so bad. I was really struggling to survive. Had a lot of trays that were attempted murder and everything. I had to wash all my food off. And then one day I didn't wash my food off and I was sick for 3 weeks, almost died.
I suspect that her illness was more than likely an example of the nocebo effect. The nocebo effect is a phenomenon where negative expectations or beliefs about a thing lead to perceived or actual negative side effects. This effect is essentially the opposite of the placebo effect, where positive expectations can lead to perceived or actual improvements. Essentially because Wuornos believed she was being poisoned and expected to be harmed. By not washing the food, she experienced the symptoms she expected when she ate the, to her mind, poisoned food. As to whether or not she was psychotic prior to her sentencing, the evidence at the time argues she wasn't. Therefore, I think that what we are probably seeing here is what we recognize as death row syndrome. It isn't an officially recognized medical diagnosis, but it colloquially describes the range of psychological disturbances experienced by inmates on death row. The characteristics and causes of this syndrome are multifactorial, involving environmental, psychological, and social factors. They include 1. The ever-present awareness of an impending execution, creating a chronic state of stress and anxiety. This is often exacerbated by the unpredictability and indefinite nature of the wait, which can span years or even decades. 2. The oppressive environment and lack of control over their fate, which can lead many death row inmates to experience severe depression. While the thought of being hung in the morning may concentrate the mind, the thought of being hung or electrocuted a decade from now tends to bring about depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. 3. The cognitive decline which has been shown to accompany long-term isolation, lack of social interaction, and lack of mental stimulation. This can manifest as memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and an impaired ability to reason. 4. The combination of the stress, isolation, and cognitive issues can combine to exacerbate pre-existing conditions or bring about the expression of previously quiescent conditions. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorders, as well as a worsening of any personality disorders, are relatively common under such circumstances. In death row syndrome, the appearance of persecutory delusions isn't uncommon. After all, the state is, literally, planning to kill you at some point in the future, so thinking they're out to get you in other ways becomes far less far-fetched and unreasonable. Wuornos' delusions are quite in keeping with the view she has of society and her punishment, namely that they are biased against her and unfair. In psychiatric terminology, we would say that they are egosyntonic. In other words, they are in keeping with her worldview and beliefs. For those interested in reading more about death row syndrome, I've included a list of links in the reference section of the description and pinned comments. These link to research into this phenomenon.
But you're okay now.
I'm okay. I'm okay. God is going to be there. Jesus Christ is going to be there. All the angels and everything. And, whatever's on the beyond. I think it's going to be more like Star Trek, beaming me up into a space vehicle, man. Then I move on, recolonize to another planet or whatever. But it's whatever's the beyond. I know it's going to be good because I didn't do anything as wrong as they said. I did the right thing. And I saved a lot of people's butts from getting hurt and killed too.
The initial Star Trek-related portion of what she said is quite a bizarre statement. You can take it a few ways. Either she is psychotic and having grandiose delusions, or this Star Trek beaming away to utopia is just a fantasy she chooses to believe because it is more comforting than the objective reality of her situation. Unfortunately, the interviewer doesn't explore this further, but it is likely this isn't a delusional belief, but rather just something she chooses to believe because it is more comforting to her than reality. I see this all the time in patients who choose to believe something unrealistic rather than face up to objective reality. They aren't delusional, just choosing to live in a comforting fantasy rather than difficult reality. The second half of her statement is less ambiguous. She is reimagining the reality of what she did, presenting herself as someone who not only didn't do anything wrong, but who, through her actions, saved a multitude of lives. In her view, the men she killed were the dangerous ones, and she was merely defending herself in the instant and society in the round. Essentially, her view is that society shouldn't be punishing her. It should reward and celebrate her for her good deeds. While it is true that there are significant levels of violence directed towards sex workers, and some of her victims had problematic forensic pasts themselves, the fact that she killed 7 in such a short time period argues against it being self-defense. This is the borderline and psychopathic desire to rewrite history and motivations in order to paint the perpetrator as the victim, something that can be seen in several of the interviews on the channel.
So are you saying that you killed in self-defense or in cold blood? Because you've changed your story. I'm just trying to
What are you
understand.
talking about? Change story on what?
No, about whether it was self-defense or not.
I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to get into depth about my cases, Nick. I'm on my way to the chamber. Nothing stopping it. You can believe it or you don't have to believe it. That's up to you, man. Put a big question mark on your film.
What more is there to say about the cops? What more do you want to say about the cops?
A lot of stuff. Did you know that they were surveilling me before I killed? And then I knew it? And that it was covered up? Did you know there was helicopters dropping down from the sky, deputy sheriff, with decoys picking me up 4 or 5 months before my arrest? It was covered up.
But nonetheless,
Nobody ever asked me
what
these
about the
questions.
cops was following you or not, Eileen?
Oh, whether cops are following me or
Okay,
not, Eileen,
okay,
what?
let's say the cops were following you.
Yeah.
Let's say they were following you.
Uh-huh.
They did everything that you're saying they did.
Uh-huh.
Nonetheless,
Yeah.
you killed 7 men.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm
did.
asking you, what got you to kill the 7
And
men?
I'm telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't
we're
you
not-
get it?
This is a very marked external locus of responsibility. According to her, she killed 7 men because the police allowed her to keep killing them. There's no taking of personal responsibility at all. She has taken a very borderline and psychopathic position. Her various narratives are that firstly, it was self-defense, and therefore she isn't guilty of murder. Secondly, even if it was murder, it wasn't her fault, because the police knew what she was doing and didn't stop her. And thirdly, that the police might even have facilitated it, so long as she was killing men that they thought of as problematic. Kudos to her for the mental gymnastics, but it doesn't stand up to reasonable scrutiny. One other thing to note is that her narrative that it was self-defense can be viewed as an example of external locus of control, since in self-defense one only reacts to what others do.
Not everybody is killing 7 people. So there must have been something in you that was getting you to
Oh,
do
you
that.
are lost, Nick.
So
I was a
explain-
hitchhiking hooker.
Right.
Running into trouble. I'd shoot the guy if I ran into trouble. Physical trouble. The cops knew it. When the physical trouble came along, let her clean the streets. And then we'll pull her in.
But how
That's
come
why.
there was so much physical trouble in because it was all in 1 year? 7 people in 1
Oh,
year.
well. Oh, well.
I personally find this the most chilling part of the interview. There's just no empathy or remorse to be seen here at all. It is like she is talking about a minor slip-up. Oh well, these things happen. No point getting too upset about it. This is the real Aileen. It is true that she had a difficult childhood and adulthood and suffered a lot of trauma, but it is also true that she was a borderline and psychopath who killed repeatedly and without remorse, empathy, or regret. If she hadn't been caught, many more would have fallen prey to her.
But why not say now?
Because I'm out of retaliation for taking my life like this and getting rich off it all these years in total pathological lying. Yeah, thanks a lot. I lost my fucking life because of it. Couldn't even get a fair trial. Couldn't even get a fair investigation or nothing. Couldn't even have my appeals right. You sabotaged my ass, society, and the cops, and the system. A woman got executed.
Again, the borderline's cry of unfairness, that the system and society were stacked against her, that they're the liars, that the trial was unfair, that the investigation was unfair, that the appeals were unfair, that she was sabotaged, that she's being hard done by. She views the whole situation as being terribly unfair to her, especially since she believes she was doing society a favor by getting rid of those 7 men, and, undoubtedly, feels that her anger at the whole situation is perfectly justified. As to her statement that she was executed after intimate assault, while we should always have sympathy for those who have been assaulted in this manner, she isn't being executed for that. She is being executed because she killed 7 men, and while understanding the role her past played in bringing to her that point is important, and illuminating it doesn't excuse it.
It was used for books and movies and shit. Ladder climbs, the election, everything else. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot. You're an inhumane bunch of fucking living bastards and bitches, and you're gonna get your asses nuked in the end. And pretty soon it's coming. 2019, Iraq's supposed to hit you anyhow. You're all gonna get nuked. You don't take fucking human life like this and just sabotage and rip it apart like Jesus on the cross.
More of the real angry Aileen is on show now. She clearly doesn't see any parallel between her actions and her punishment.
You don't take fucking human life like this and just sabotage and rip it apart like Jesus on the cross.
I find it highly ironic that she now seems to care so much about the taking of human life. Like a true psychopath, she just doesn't accept responsibility and doesn't see her victims as being as human or worthwhile as herself. She is the center of her universe, and everything she did and does is justified and right. It's quite chilling.
You see, thanks a lot for all the fucking money I made off of you. And not care about a human being and the truth being told. Now I know what Jesus was going through.
Her suffering is Christ-like. She's just so self-deluded. And now we get to the bit of the interview which explains why she gave it, what her motivation was. Was it a victim's cry for understanding, or an angry woman's railing against the coming of the night?
They've been trying to tell the truth.
No, she hasn't. She's been peddling her own self-deluding, self-justifying narrative featuring a total lack of insight or empathy. To the extent that the narrative unintendedly reveals a lot about the real her, it was truthful, but that certainly wasn't her intent.
And I keep getting it stepped on. Concerned about I'm not giving you book and movie info. I'm giving you info for investigations and stuff, and that's it. We're going to have to cut this interview, Nick. I'm not going to go into any more detail. I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass. Okay, let's go.
And, finally, she admits the real reason for the interview. She wanted to provide information for additional investigation, etc. It isn't spelled out, but there are only 2 reasons for allocating time on her last day to provide information for investigation. Either she wants those investigations to continue posthumously and clear her name, something that isn't at all believable given her psychological makeup, or she is hoping for a last-minute reprieve. I know a lot of viewers will find the idea that she might have been hoping for a reprieve baffling, but you have to remember that her perception of reality and what was possible just isn't the same as yours or mine. Her brain structure and function, and her personality combine to make her thought processes alien to 99% of us. And the other 1% are predators just like her.
It was really pretty incredible that Aileen had just sailed through the psychiatric test the day before. It makes you wonder what you'd have to do to fail.
This highlights a common misconception among people that being psychiatrically unwell is the same as being unfit for trial or execution. It isn't that simple. Under Florida law, a person is, generally speaking, considered insane if, at the time of the offense, they didn't know what they were doing or its consequences, or they knew what they were doing but didn't know it was wrong as a result of mental illness. Additionally, to demonstrate competence to be executed, the person must not be insane in the legal sense and must understand the nature of the death penalty and why it was imposed. When looked at with this legal understanding in place, it is easy to see that Wuornos knew what she did, knew the consequences of what she did, and knew it was, potentially, wrong at the time of the acts. Additionally, she clearly demonstrates understanding of the nature of the death penalty and why it was imposed. An interesting question may occur to some of you. What happens if someone is incompetent to be executed due to insanity? Well, they are treated until such time as their competence is restored and then put to death. To be fair, I can't really blame them for malingering in such cases. Aileen Wuornos' final interview reveals the profound impact of her borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, exacerbated by probable elements of psychosis, likely intensified by death row syndrome. Her distorted perceptions and lack of empathy, characteristic of her high score on the Hare psychopathy checklist, were further compounded by the severe stress and isolation experienced on death row. I believe these factors best explain her behavior during the interview. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. By doing so, you'll be the first to know when I release new episodes, offering fresh perspectives on some of the most challenging and intriguing cases in criminal history. If you found today's episode insightful, we invite you to explore more of our content, which is on your screen now. Before we go, I'd also like to extend thanks to our first Patreon detective, Carol Oas. Thanks for supporting the channel, Carol.